Today, our speaker is Ken Van Doren. He's a building contractor from Boston, Wisconsin. Has owned several small businesses. Ken was born and raised in the Milwaukee area and is an honor graduate of UW-Madison. His life experiences and his independent studies have forced him to change much of his views of the world and how it works, especially with regards to economic matters. Ken also has his own internet radio show that you can check out on revolutionbroadcasting.com. It can be heard live on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Or they also have archives that you can check out as well. So please give a warm welcome to Mr. Ken Van Doren.
Thank you. I wonder if we might pull the crowd a little toward the front here.
For you.
So it's a little cozier.
Good for you.
And I don't like to have this great distance. And that way, if you disagree with what I'm saying, you'll have a harder time escaping.
It's closer to Berlin.
That too. Tomatoes. Tomatoes. Well, by the way, my guest tomorrow is going to be former gubernatorial candidate Ed Thompson, who's now the current mayor of Toma, Wisconsin. So it should be an interesting show, and I got a bunch of other very interesting guests lined up in the very near future. I kind of fell into the study of economics because as a businessman, as a government employee, I found that the world wasn't working quite the way I was taught in high school in the Milwaukee area and in college in Madison. And I guess that was part of the announcement here. But it led me to a pretty deep study of the field of economics, history, and politics. And again, it forced me to make some different conclusions. And before we get into the meat of my talk here, I'm going to give you a little quiz. True or false, economic policy should be decided apolitically without regard to politics. What's the answer, folks? True or false? I don't hear you.
True.
Well, okay, that's one answer. My answer is false. Because every single action you take or decide not to take is based upon your political philosophy. It's impossible to have an economic policy that isn't based upon your view of the political world. And in fact, the study of economics was once widely known as political economy, which marries the two sciences together. Okay, question number 2. What is the year that will live in infamy? We all know the day that will live in infamy. What is the year that will live in infamy?
1910.
No, that's close,
1913, excuse me.
1913. Anyone disagree? Ding, 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 ding. The $64,000 question. Ben gets it right. 1913. Why, Ben? Tell us why.
That was the inception of the Federal Reserve.
What else? Income tax. Okay. 2 institutions that have, I believe, enslaved us. We have no financial privacy now because of the income tax law. And as I'm about to display here, the Federal Reserve has helped to destroy our wealth, or a good portion of it. Okay, here's one. How big a money supply is enough? You know, the banks are creating money all the time, which I'm going to demonstrate the mechanism later on. But how much is enough money? This kind of goes to the heart of the argument of the Keynesian and other monetarists, including Milton Friedman, versus the Austrians, which I am in the camp of. And according to one, Keynes believed that you could manipulate the money supply to spur the economy when things were going down. And the Austrians point out that any supply of money is enough so long as prices and wages are free to adjust. Some of this stuff you might have to take on faith, but I encourage you, if you disagree with me, do further study. A lot of this is a big bite to take at one time, and some of the things I'm talking to you about tonight, it took me over 2 years to settle in my own mind after constant study, in my spare time anyway. Okay, here's another question. The current economic wealth, I did it again. The current economic meltdown was caused by deregulation in the free market, true or false?
False.
Okay, why do you say that? Who wants to answer that? Randy, you want to give us an answer?
We didn't get deregulation.
Okay, that's good. What about the free market side of it?
Have very little free market.
Okay, very good. Let me elaborate on that. I think this is important. And I believe that the news media and economists like E.J. Dionne and Dave Clausius and our world famous John Kenneth Galbraith and of course Paul Krugman, words fail me on that guy. We've got a Nobel Prize for science fiction, won by Al Gore. Now we've got one for social science fiction, won by Paul Krugman. But they neglect the participation of the government in the destruction of this economy. And I'm going to take a few minutes to point out some of the things that the government did that led us to where we are. First, you had the Community Reinvestment Act, which was originally passed under Carter and then progressively made worse primarily by Democrats in Congress over the years. But this mandated that banks give loans to people who truly were not qualified. And even at that, there was a lot of fraud committed in what qualifications were presented. And this problem was made worse by lawsuits from that infamous organization, that public-spirited group called ACORN. And those lawsuits were prosecuted, at least a few of them, by Mr. Obama himself before he got into the Illinois State Senate and the presidency. So you've got fraudulent contracts from the get-go. Then you had government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that were created to buy up mortgages, to drive more money into the housing sector. And again, these folks committed fraud. Franklin Raines, who was the former CEO of Fannie Mae, was found guilty of fraud and had to give some of the millions that he earned back to the government. I guess he was fined. But really, for the fraud that he committed, he belongs in jail, in my opinion. And instead, he got to be Mr. Obama's economic advisor, which explains part of the reason why we're so screwed up right now. Another thing, deregulation. They say there was deregulation. That's absolutely false. There was far, far more regulation during the last 8 years than there was deregulation. And a good measure of that is the Federal Register. That's basically a register of everything that Congress and every agency in government does. And while there's other things in there, like the bill submitted to Congress, there's also all the regulations that the bureaucrats come up with. And every year, there was over 80,000 pages of new regulations added to the Federal Register. And most of those pages were regulations, new ones. And a lot of those were to the financial industry. So where's the deregulation? It's simply not there. Now, the one thing that the government could have, and I think should have done, is enforce prohibitions against fraud. This is the role of government, to protect people against the use of force, fraud, misrepresentation, as well as physical assaults on their person and property. And this is the one area of regulation that the government failed on. Because as I said, the frauds were committed in the loans, and the people who assessed the properties in the agencies that bundled and rated the derivatives too high that were sold on the stock market. But there's one area of fraud. Well, hold it. Before I get there, let's ask one more question. What's the greatest fraud, the greatest Ponzi scheme of all time? Bernie Madoff or something else? Okay, that's a bigger one than Madoff by far. And it's a top contender. But I maintain that the greatest Ponzi scheme, the greatest fraud of all time is our Federal Reserve, as I'm going to attempt to show today. And why is that? They create money out of nothing.